Now, my first guest, who I can look at him
Me too.
and for some reason get the giggles. As you know, he's an Emmy Award-winning performer. On Tuesday night, May 25th, he's hosting a special along with you.
Imagine it's late at night in the golden age of television. The studio lights are low, the band is warming up, and across America, millions of viewers are waiting for Johnny Carson to appear. For decades, The Tonight Show wasn't just late-night TV. It was the pulse of American culture. And when Johnny sat behind that desk, something magical always happened. But the most unforgettable nights? Those came when legendary guests walked onto that stage and left an audience, and Johnny himself, completely speechless. From comedians who nearly stole the show, to Hollywood icons who brought Johnny to tears, to singers whose voices silenced the entire studio, these moments weren't just talk show appearances. They became living pieces of television history. Some were hilarious, some were deeply emotional, and a few were so shocking they're still whispered about today. So let's rewind time and step back into Carson's world. The laughter, the surprises, and the unforgettable moments that proved why The Tonight Show became the stage where legends were made.
Lucille Ball. Now, Lucille wasn't just a television star. She was the television star. By the time she stepped onto Carson's stage, she had already cemented her place as comedy royalty. People didn't just know her, they adored her. I Love Lucy had changed the landscape of television, and even years after the show ended, Lucille carried that same spark everywhere she went. The night she appeared on The Tonight Show, you could feel the electricity in the air. The audience's applause wasn't the usual warm welcome, it was thunderous, like they were greeting an old friend they hadn't seen in years. Carson gave that classic smirk of his, but there was also a glint in his eye, almost as if he knew he was about to lose control of his own show. And he was right, because Lucille didn't do normal interviews. She didn't sit politely, answer questions, and let Johnny guide the conversation. No, Lucille treated The Tonight Show like her own personal playground. At one point, Johnny asked her a harmless question about her recent projects. Instead of answering directly, Lucille launched into a full-blown performance. She began describing in dramatic detail a ridiculous fight she claimed she'd had with a neighbor earlier that week. She stood up, waved her arms wildly, mimicked voices, and even stomped across the stage as though she were reenacting the entire scene. The audience erupted. Johnny tried to interject, but he was laughing too hard to form words. What made it even funnier was that Carson, who usually prided himself on being the calm anchor of the show, completely broke. He leaned back in his chair, slapped the desk, and tried to compose himself, but Lucille kept going, piling on the chaos. The more he laughed, the more she pushed. And that was Lucille's genius. She didn't just tell stories, she lived them right there in front of you. She blurred the line between reality and performance until you couldn't tell if she was recalling something that actually happened or inventing it on the spot just to get a laugh. Her appearances on The Tonight Show were unpredictable, and that unpredictability was thrilling. Carson was a master interviewer, but even he knew when he was outmatched. Instead of trying to reel her back in, he let her go, knowing that the magic of Lucille Ball was in her freedom to do whatever came to her mind. By the end of her visits, Johnny's questions were forgotten, the script was abandoned, and the audience had tears streaming down their faces from laughter. Lucille Ball didn't just appear on Carson's show, she took it over. And in doing so, she reminded the world why she would forever be the queen of television comedy.
If Lucille Ball brought chaos and pure comedic energy, then Bob Hope brought precision. Where Lucy thrived in wild unpredictability, Bob thrived in control. Razor-sharp one-liners, perfectly timed pauses, and a delivery so natural it felt like he was improvising, even though every word was carefully calculated. By the time he sat across from Johnny Carson, Bob wasn't just a comedian, he was a national institution. He had entertained American troops for decades, hosted countless specials, and built a reputation as the guy who always had the perfect joke ready for any occasion. When Bob Hope walked on stage, audiences didn't just clap, they leaned in, ready to be hit with punchline after punchline. And that's exactly what they got. From the moment Johnny introduced him, Bob didn't wait for questions. He just started firing. One after another, jokes rolled off his tongue. Johnny would set him up with a simple remark, sometimes not even a question, and Bob would twist it into comedy gold. "Johnny, I've been around so long, they don't even ask me how old I am anymore. They just carbon date me." That was Bob's style. Quick, biting, but never mean-spirited. He knew how to make fun of himself, of Carson, and even the absurdities of Hollywood without ever crossing into cruelty. What made his appearances so memorable was the sheer speed of it all. Carson loved letting guests talk, but with Bob, he could barely get a word in. The audience wasn't just laughing, they were gasping, trying to catch their breath between punchlines. Even Johnny himself often doubled over, wiping tears from his eyes, struggling to regain control of the show. But here's the twist. Despite his machine gun delivery, Bob always left space for Johnny. He'd fire a zinger, wait for Carson's reaction, and then spin it into something even funnier. It was like watching two heavyweight boxers sparring, except instead of punches, it was jokes flying across the stage. Behind the laughs, there was also a kind of comfort. Bob represented an older era of comedy, one built on vaudeville timing and carefully structured gags. Seeing him with Carson was like watching two eras shake hands. Johnny with his modern, smooth late-night style, and Bob with his old-school precision. Together, they created a rhythm that was impossible to replicate. By the end of his segments, Bob Hope always left the audience buzzing, Johnny grinning ear to ear, and viewers at home feeling like they had just witnessed comedy royalty in action. His visits weren't just interviews, they were showcases, proof of why Bob Hope is and still is considered one of the greatest entertainers in American history. When Jack Benny stepped onto Johnny Carson's stage, the air shifted, not with noise, but with stillness. He didn't rush, he didn't announce himself, he simply arrived. And the audience, almost instinctively, leaned in. Benny's comedy wasn't about rapid-fire jokes or wild antics, it was about patience. A glance to the side, the smallest tilt of the head, or that famous raised eyebrow could land harder than a whole monologue. He used silence like an instrument, stretching a moment until the laugh had no choice but to come. And Carson admired that deeply. Johnny was a master of timing himself, but Benny's timing ran on its own clock, unhurried, deliberate, and utterly in control. On air, Johnny would toss him a simple setup and then pause. The room would wait, breath held, until Benny finally delivered the line. And when he did, the release of laughter was bigger than the words themselves. Carson watched him like a student. He wasn't trying to outdo the joke, he was studying the space around it. Because Benny didn't just tell jokes, he built an environment where comedy had to happen. Even backstage, he adjusted everything with precision. The height of a stool, the cut of a line, the beat before a word. Every choice was about rhythm, not comfort. Carson respected that craft. He often admitted, at least to friends, that whenever he slowed his own monologue or let a laugh breathe, he was tipping his hat to Jack Benny. Not copying, honoring. Because Benny showed him something rare. If you respect the audience enough to wait, they'll reward you with a laugh that belongs to both of you. For Carson, Jack Benny wasn't just funny. He was a blueprint, proof that comedy doesn't need noise to be powerful. Sometimes, all it takes is a pause, a look, and the courage to let silence do the heavy lifting. If Frank Sinatra was the untouchable legend, Dean Martin was the lovable rogue. Where Frank carried an air of mystery and power, Dean strolled onto Carson's stage with a grin, a glass in hand, and the kind of charm that could disarm anyone. He wasn't trying to impress. He didn't have to. Dean Martin was Dean Martin, the man who made not caring look like an art form. From the moment he sat down, it was clear why Johnny loved having him on. Dean didn't follow the rules of a talk show. He bent them, teased them, sometimes ignored them entirely. If Carson asked a question, Dean might answer with a joke, a song, or a mischievous sideways glance that told the audience he was up to something. And when Dean laughed, that easy, musical laugh, the room couldn't help but join in. Part of the magic was the drunk act. Dean had perfected it years earlier on stage and television, making audiences believe he was always a little tipsy, glass in hand, words slurred just enough to get a laugh. But behind the act was razor-sharp timing. Johnny knew it, the audience knew it, and Dean played it brilliantly. A stumble, a pause, a lazy wave of the hand. They weren't accidents. They were deliberate choices, polished over decades until they looked effortless. Carson adored that style because it mirrored his own philosophy. Comedy should look natural, not forced. With Dean, it wasn't about delivering perfect one-liners. It was about creating a mood, an atmosphere where laughter flowed like a good drink and the audience felt like they were in on the joke. And then there was the music. Dean Martin could be mid-conversation, cracking jokes with Johnny, when suddenly he'd slip into a song. No microphone adjustment, no build-up, just that velvet voice filling the studio. The audience would go quiet, soaking in every note, and then burst into applause when he wrapped it up with a wink and a shrug, as if to say, no big deal. Behind the scenes, Dean was just as generous as he appeared. He greeted crew members by name, shared drinks after tapings, and never acted like he was above anyone. Carson respected that. For all of Dean's celebrity, he carried himself like a man who hadn't forgotten his roots. But what really cemented his place on Carson's private list was the way he made Johnny crack. Dean had a gift for slipping past Carson's composure. Sometimes it was a playful jab. Sometimes a mock-serious story about his Rat Pack days. Sometimes just the way he deliberately dragged out a silence until Johnny couldn't hold in his laughter anymore. And when Johnny lost it, the audience followed. Dean Martin's visits to The Tonight Show weren't just interviews. They were parties, lighthearted, unpredictable, and filled with that rare chemistry that can't be faked. Together, Johnny and Dean reminded viewers that television wasn't just about structure and polish. Sometimes it was about sitting back, raising a glass, and letting the good times roll. When Ella Fitzgerald walked onto The Tonight Show stage, the atmosphere changed instantly. The band sat up straighter, the audience leaned forward, and even Johnny Carson shifted. No longer the sharp-tongued host, but a quiet listener. He didn't interrupt. He didn't throw in a joke. He just watched. Ella didn't arrive with big gestures or flashy tricks. Her entrances were modest, a nod to the band, a quick smile at Johnny, and then she let her voice do the rest. That first note always felt like it had been waiting in the air for her to claim it. Smooth, effortless, and rich with emotion. Carson loved precision, and Ella's precision wasn't mechanical, it was human. Every phrase carried a story. Every pause felt intentional. When she slipped into a scat run, the band answered like old friends who knew exactly where she was headed. For Johnny, it was the kind of performance that reminded him why he cared so much about craft. Nothing wasted, everything earned. Backstage, the legend softened into something even more impressive. She wasn't aloof or untouchable. She learned names. She thanked the sound crew for balancing her voice just right. She smiled at the stagehands, chatted with the band, and carried herself with a quiet humility that never matched the size of her fame. Johnny noticed that. He admired it. On camera, her music created a kind of spell. Not dazzling or overwhelming, but honest. She didn't perform at people. She invited them in. And Johnny, usually the one steering the night, let her steer instead. He knew the best thing he could do was stay silent and let the moment breathe. For Johnny, Ella Fitzgerald wasn't just another guest. She was a reminder that true artistry doesn't need spectacle. All it needs is honesty, discipline, and a voice that tells the truth so clearly it makes the whole room forget to breathe.
Jimmy Stewart didn't need a grand entrance. No big wave, no flashy smile. He walked out slow, shoulders slightly hunched, that unmistakable drawl already softening the edges of the room. The audience didn't roar. They leaned in. And Johnny Carson, who usually thrived on quick wit and sharp timing, shifted into something different. With Stewart, the pace slowed down. Johnny admired plenty of performers for their cleverness or energy, but Stewart offered something rarer: sincerity. His stories weren't polished for maximum laughs or applause. They unfolded gently, like he was sharing them around a kitchen table. He'd start with a hesitant, "well," and suddenly the whole room was leaning closer, waiting for where it might go. Carson, usually ready with a fast quip, often just listened. That wasn't his normal rhythm, but with Stewart, it felt right. He knew the laughs would come, not because Stewart chased them, but because the truth in his delivery made them inevitable. The night Stewart read his poem about his dog Bo remains one of The Tonight Show's most unforgettable moments. Johnny's usual composure cracked. His eyes welled up, his voice wavered, and for once, the man who made millions laugh showed unguarded vulnerability. Later, Carson admitted Stewart was the most genuine man ever to sit in that chair. It wasn't just admiration, it was respect. Offstage, nothing changed. Stewart carried the same warmth with the crew as he did with the audience. He remembered names, asked about families, and never acted like Hollywood royalty. To Johnny, that mattered more than credits or accolades. He measured people by how they treated those who weren't in the spotlight, and Jimmy passed that test effortlessly. For Carson, Stewart embodied a kind of steady, decent America that felt rare even then. In his presence, Johnny wasn't the host under pressure to be clever. He was just a boy from Nebraska, reminded of why kindness and humility mattered. Jimmy Stewart didn't just charm an audience, he grounded the entire show. And for Johnny Carson, that grounding was priceless.
George Burns didn't chase the spotlight. He carried it with him, like a familiar coat draped over his shoulders, cigar in hand, glasses low on his nose. The moment he stepped onto Johnny Carson's stage, the energy didn't spike, it settled. The audience trusted him before he spoke a single word, and Johnny did too. Burns' comedy wasn't about speed or volume, it was about grace. He placed jokes the way a careful host sets out crystal, with patience, polish, and just the right pause. He'd take a slow draw from his cigar, glance toward the audience as if sharing a secret, then drop a line so perfectly timed you could almost hear the laugh click into place. Carson loved that elegance. Plenty of guests were funny, but Burns made funny feel civilized. His humor wasn't about forcing laughter, it was about inviting it. On stage, he treated conversation like a waltz. Johnny would lead with a gentle question about vaudeville, about the old circuits, about the move from radio to television, and Burns would glide, his stories landing without strain. He never competed with the host. He collaborated. Backstage, the legend matched the man. Burns arrived early, greeted the security guard by name, shook the prop master's hand, and whispered a one-liner to a stagehand as if passing along a gift. By the time he reached the couch, the entire crew stood a little taller. Johnny noticed. He always measured a guest not just by their talent, but by the way the room felt after they left it. Burns left it warmer. Carson admired the architecture of his act. There was the setup you saw and the setup you didn't. A rhythm of tiny beats, a look, a breath, a tilt, a line, then the offhand tag that trained the audience to laugh on cue without ever feeling coached. It was invisible craft, sturdy and timeless, that made television feel like vaudeville reborn under better lights. For Johnny, who valued control, Burns was the blueprint. Authority without noise, humor without haste. When the segment wrapped, applause felt less like release and more like gratitude. Burns would tap his cigar, smile at the crew, and stroll off as though he were leaving a living room, not a studio. With George Burns, The Tonight Show didn't just get laughs, it got class. When Sammy Davis Jr. walked onto Johnny Carson's stage, it didn't feel like just another guest had arrived. It felt like the whole building had been plugged into a live wire. The band hit a note, the audience roared, and Johnny's smile stretched wide before Sammy even sat down, because he knew what was about to happen. Sammy carried an energy that television could barely contain. He hugged the stagehands, cracked a joke with the band, and tossed out a playful jab at the makeup crew before stepping under the lights. By the time he reached Johnny's desk, the entire studio was already buzzing. Carson once said Sammy could light up Burbank without a plug, and it wasn't just a line, it was the truth. On air, Sammy never stayed still. He danced in his chair, drummed rhythms on the armrests, and dropped impressions so seamless they left the crowd gasping. One moment he'd slip into Sinatra's croon, the next Bogart's gravel, and then Jerry Lewis's mugging, all within half a minute. Johnny, usually the sharpest guy in the room, leaned back grinning like a fan just happy to be along for the ride. But what Carson admired most wasn't the flash, it was the generosity behind it. Sammy didn't treat The Tonight Show like a stage for himself. He treated it like a party. Everyone was invited, the audience, the band, the crew, even Johnny. He made space for others to shine, lifting the room instead of trying to own it. Backstage, he carried that same spirit. Sammy taught stagehands little dance steps, joked with interns about their ties, and even balanced a hat on his nose just to break the tension before a tough taping. Johnny noticed how the crew lit up around him, and to Carson, that mattered as much as ratings or applause. For Johnny, Sammy Davis Jr. embodied everything entertainment should be: alive, spontaneous, and kind. When Sammy left the stage, Carson didn't just have a great segment, he had a memory. The Tonight Show wasn't just television those nights, it was a celebration.
Betty White didn't demand attention when she walked onto Johnny Carson's stage, she earned it. The second she smiled, the audience leaned forward as if they were in on a secret. Johnny, who valued quick minds and sharp timing, sat up a little straighter. He knew what Betty brought with her: fearless wit, effortless charm, and a warmth that never felt staged. From the very first exchange, she matched Johnny beat for beat. He'd toss out a sly setup, and Betty would catch it clean, flip it, and send it back with a line that landed even harder. Watching them together was like seeing two pros trade solos, neither trying to overpower the other, both pushing the rhythm just enough to make it exciting. Her humor had bite, but it never drew blood. She could tease Johnny's ego, poke fun at late night's boys' club, or slip a clever twist into a harmless story. And she did it all with that disarming smile that made everyone feel included. What Carson admired was her control. Plenty of guests tried to swing for the fences and missed. Betty didn't need to swing hard. She placed her jokes with precision, walked them right where they needed to go, and made it look easy. That balance, bold and graceful at the same time, gave Johnny freedom too. He could throw out stranger tags or riskier asides, knowing she would catch them. That trust was rare, and it showed. Off camera, Betty was just as remarkable. She stayed after the segment, chatting with stage managers about their day, thanking camera operators for their work, and treating interns like old friends. If a makeup artist apologized for fussing, Betty would quip that the mirror was the real diva, and she meant it. Her kindness wasn't performance, it was habit. She remembered names, even pets, circling back weeks later to ask about them. Johnny noticed. He always measured people by how they treated those behind the scenes, and Betty passed that test effortlessly. For Carson, Betty White wasn't just a funny guest. She was the perfect balance of wit and grace, someone who could spar with him on air and make the whole crew feel seen off it. If he could have booked her every week, he would have. With Betty White, The Tonight Show wasn't just funny, it felt good. And for Johnny, that was the highest standard of all.
At the end of the day, Johnny Carson wasn't just running a talk show. He was building a space where something real could happen. When the cameras cut and the band played out, he didn't measure the night by ratings or joke counts. He measured it by those rare moments that felt honest, unplanned, and alive. That was his secret. Behind the jokes, the timing, and the cool composure, Carson was chasing something simple. A show that reminded people why they loved gathering around a screen in the first place. To laugh, to feel, and to share something you couldn't fake. And that's why decades later, the magic still holds. Which Johnny Carson moment hit you the hardest? Drop your favorite memory or clip in the comments. Hit like if this story brought back the late-night magic, and subscribe for more deep dives into TV history you won't want to miss.